So, the story I shared last video was just a skosh incomplete. You see, what had happened was that I did spend a few days in Dallas and I did visit that one really cool little friendly local game store. What I didn't tell you was that I went to another friendly local game store right before I went to that one. The one I went to this time was Common Ground Gaming, or maybe Common Grounds Gaming. I forget the name, but it was a really cool, not so little store. And today, I'll tell you a little bit about my trip, and I'll tell you a little bit about the model that I picked up while I was there, the Aeldar Wraithlord. It's a cool model that I have a bit of a history with, but I was there and I wanted to pick something up, so I thought, yep, this is the guy. I don't have one of these in my army. It doesn't need one, but I want one, so let's paint it up. Yeah, let's do that. So you might have noticed kind of a different title card than I usually do. I'm playing around with different editing software, platform kind of a deal, kind of playing around with it, see if I like it better than the one I've used for most of this channel's history. So far it looks good, but it's a little plain. I may spruce it up a little bit, but that's a journey for another tale. The story that I want to focus on this time around is painting this guy. And painting this guy was actually fairly easy. The hardest part, I think, was to get him into a decent pose. You'll notice how just overwhelmingly bleh this guy is posed. And when I first saw the box, I was like, it looks really, really boring, especially if I have more than one of these guys. They're just going to be standing around like there. As it turns out, you can pose this guy a little bit more dynamically than this. Quite frankly, I have no idea why Games Workshop went with this pose. It is perhaps the least dynamic, most boring pose they could have ever chosen for their box art. That's a really weird move. But it is an older model, so I'll cut him some slack, especially because you can do some pretty cool things with him. And one of those pretty cool things is you can mod him a little bit. And so that's what I did. I didn't take any footage of the modding because, quite frankly, I didn't think it was going to work. You see, my modding skills aren't very good. They're not as good as my painting skills. So you draw your own conclusions. But I gave it a shot anyway because I wanted this model in my army. And I thought, let's give it a try. And it was a very minor bit of modding. Basically, all I did was I took one leg and I cut a piece of it off so that I can get that otherwise very straight leg, give it a little bit of an angle so that I could show him on the base. The model, I don't know why he's a dude, it's just the way my brain is wired, but the model is now stepping on a piece of terrain on the base to make him look like he's actually walking as opposed to standing there. Honestly, if you don't mod the legs, there's very little you can do to show him being dynamic. I mean, I guess you can adjust the feet a little bit so you can kind of show him in mid-stride, but the legs are very, very stiff. Do not like, but you can fix it, and it's relatively easy. Basically, because this was a bit of a more aggressive mod, I took off that chunk of the leg, the back part of the knee, with this. It's a little hobby saw, and it helps you cut through larger pieces of mini plastic. I cut off the back of the knee so that it could bend a little nicer, and then I secured the leg back into its new pose with a little combination of this stuff. It's green stuff, not by Green Stuff, this is by Green Stuff World. Pretty good stuff. And I also use this sprue glue, which I've created. I think it's too thick, but I don't know. I'm still experimenting with the right texture, the right consistency. It does the job pretty well. Not as good as I'd like, but pretty well. If you're curious about making your own sprue glue, you could probably check out, there's a bunch of videos on making this stuff. Those are the videos that I watched to make it, to learn that I needed it. So if you're curious about doing that, check out those other channels. They know a lot more than I do about this stuff. Maybe one day when I perfect the formula for myself, I'll have a video on it. But for now, learn from someone who's better than me. That's what I did. Once I got the pose where I wanted it, I added the little terrain bits to the base so that he could be standing on something and I can secure and solidify the pose just where I wanted it. And I assembled the rest of the model because it was fairly straightforward. What I didn't do though is I didn't attach the arms or the weapons because I wanted to be able to reach into all the crevices to do my painting. Once it was all done, I can attach the arms, I can attach the weapons, and my paint job will be better for it. I generally avoid sub-assemblies, but I'm slowly learning when sub-assembly is going to be worth the effort. So, for the paint job, which approach did I take? Well, my craft world is Iliandan, which means I'm going to use a lot of blues and I'm going to use even more yellows. And for the yellows, I went with some Citadel paints. For my mid-tone, I used this guy. This was the dry brush paint that I used most on this model. Averland Sunset, it's a very nice kind of mustardy yellow. It goes on really nice on the models. Whether you're layer painting or dry brushing, the paint has a great consistency. For the highlights on them, which I also dry brushed, I went with a little Uriel yellow. It's a brighter yellow. I don't like it as much as a little too bright for most of my model, but it's an excellent highlight yellow. So the secondary colors that I also dry brushed on this model, dry brushed for the most part, was blue. And for the blues, I went with a blue I hadn't worked with before, but I got when I was in Dallas. I tell you, I love this blue. It's Vallejo Colors, Vallejo Game Colors' new formula. I haven't used their old formula, so I don't know how improved it is over their old, but man, I really like it. It goes on smooth as a dry brush. I haven't tried using this for layers or blending, so I don't know how it's going to work, but for dry brush, man, I think this is my new blue. And for the highlights, I went with a lighter shade of blue, which I usually use for my towel, but it works pretty well as a highlight for this blue. It's Army Painter's Acrylic Crystal Blue. It's a very nice shade of blue. It works excellent as a highlight color. I guess there is a tertiary color I should probably talk about. The weapons in my Eldar army are always white. Well, always since I decided that my weapons were going to be white. The first batch of Eldar models didn't have white weapons. Maybe I'll correct that someday. But for now, I think I've got the formula pretty well set. For the weapons, I used kind of a base coat of this kind of medium gray. It's called Uniform Gray. I'm sure your preferred paint line has a variation on this. It's kind of a just smack in the middle kind of a gray. I use this as my kind of first layer, my shadow. I want to establish that. Then to make the weapons read as white as opposed to light gray, I went over them with a dry brush of Army Painter's Mummy Robes. It's a very nice off-white, and it's pretty creamy. It's not chalky like the matte white, which I ultimately used for the highlights on those same weapons. Wherever I could, I applied these paints with a dry brush technique, and it worked pretty well for the most part. But if you've used dry brushing at all, you know that it's pretty good for large surface areas. It's really not very good for small details. But that's okay. If you get paint that you didn't want on parts of the model that you were intending to paint a different color, you can always go in and touch them up with a little bit of layer paints once the dry brush is all said and done. And applying the dry brush isn't very hard. I mean, you get better with practice, certainly, but I recommend using a dry palette. This is the one that I use right now. It's from Artist Opus. It's seen some things, and these are the brushes I've been using. There's some off-brand stuff from Amazon.com. They work pretty well, even though they got stained really quickly. Kind of yuck. I wish they made these with black bristles. These white bristles, they're just not working out for me. Now this is where I should probably warn you about the ugly phase of your paint job. It's derailed me a couple of times for longer than I cared to admit. But the first coat or two of your dry brush, and even if you're using glazing or layer painting, they're not going to look great, as you can see here. But that's okay, because you can add to that paint, and adding successive layers, you can darken up the colors, you can make them more vibrant, you can correct some of those mistakes, and honestly, you're always going to use multiple layers of paint, no matter what technique you're using for the most part. So this is no different. If it's not yellow enough, if there's too much black, if it looks splotchy, that's okay. Go over it again and it'll go, maybe not all the way away, but it'll look a lot better with successive coats. So I went through that all pretty quickly. I've talked about dry brushing a lot on this channel, so I won't bore you with the details, but most of the painting on this model was done with that technique. I went back in with some layer paints and I did apply some edge highlighting because I wanted a little bit more variation on the kind of the major pieces of the model, and I think I like the results. Edge highlighting isn't the solution for every one of your models, but I think for larger models, for vehicles, it's well worth your time. And once that was all done, I just had a few details left to add. I got my primary melee weapon. I made sure that was nice and bright. I did that by using Army Painter's contrast paints. They were a little risky for me because I was still using the first edition, not the much improved second edition. But they bring a certain something to those parts that you apply them to that I just can't get anywhere else. So I take the risk, and this time it paid off. No major errors to speak of, and the results look pretty good. I used these contrast paints or speed paints on the main weapon, the big old sword that this Wraithlord is carrying, and for the emissive effects, like there's a plasma cannon on his shoulder, that hot plasma is painted with a kind of a blue speed paint, and the few gems that are on this model, those Aeldar gems that Aeldar always have, that I hit that with a kind of a green version of that same speed paint, and the results are pretty good. Now, I've just talked about a few of the details that I applied to this model, but I think that it would be a better idea to show you the results of the model so that I can talk about some of the things I liked, some of the things I didn't like, and see what you think. As I do some of this painting, I think it'd be a good idea to tell you a little bit about this friendly local game store that I went to, Common Grounds Gaming, I think it was called. It was a really cool store. I don't have any actual footage of me inside the store because I'm kind of embarrassed filming inside of these stores. Beyond just there's people in there and they don't necessarily consent to me filming them. Yes, it's a public place. You don't necessarily have the expectation of privacy, but still it's kind of weird and creepy for a 40-something-year-old man walking around with his camera taking video of people. And wouldn't be focusing on people, I'm focusing on all the goodies on the shelves that I really kind of want to take home with me. But it's hard to communicate that. I think that if I was a bigger YouTuber or maybe a streamer, like if people could go see me or find me on the internet, it helps kind of explain what I'm doing. But I have a very small channel. There's a really, really good chance that nobody has seen me, nobody from that store has ever seen me and knows that what I'm doing is okay. I'm not being a creep, I'm just doing this for the channel. And I'm conflicted about my hobby, not the 40K part, although I'm a little conflicted about that too. In that, when I meet a new potential love interest, I don't come out the gate saying, oh, I paint little plastic toys for fun. I leave that for once I've figured out that, okay, we've clicked, then I'll set them up for the disappointment, just to make sure that they know what they're getting into. Full disclosure and all that. But more specifically, telling people that I have a YouTube channel, it makes me feel weird. See, this is a hobby for me. It's not my identity. It's something I kind of do on the side. My primary identity is it's a higher ed professional. I work in higher ed. I'm kind of a scientist. I'm kind of an author. I'm kind of a data guy. It's complicated, but that's my role. When I think about who I am, it's that guy, not the guy who paints models and posts videos on the internet. If somehow I ever go viral and maybe that'll change, but I find it really weird to tell people that I do this for fun. So if there are people in the store, and there were a ton of people in this store on a Monday afternoon of all days, I try to kind of sneak video here and there wherever I can, but if I can't sneak, I won't do it. It just makes me feel better. But man, this store was jumping. There was a ton of people there, probably over a dozen, maybe closer to 20, 25 people. It was one of the larger stores that I've been to, and they had a huge selection of stuff. As a case in point, I found out there's a Street Fighter 2 miniature game. Did you know that? Because I sure didn't. I was sort of tempted to pick some up. Except that I'm really not that big of an arcade fighter player, so it was just interesting, just not interesting enough to pick up a box. But maybe if I ever find myself in Dallas, I might just get one of those, just for the novelty, you know? This store even had a bunch of paints that I hadn't heard of before, like I think Turbo Dork was something that they sold. They sold a couple of other lines. They had a huge rack of Army Painter, among others. It was a cool experience. I look forward to going back and visiting. The people there were all pretty friendly. If you ever find yourself in Dallas, pretty decent place to go. And as I was preparing for the narrative portion of this video, I went on their website, and they have a pretty cool ethos. It's all about inclusivity and being cool with each other, and that really resonates with me. So kudos to Common Grounds Gaming. You guys are doing great. Love your ethos. I'll be back to your store. I will. There he is. I kind of like the results. He looks a little bit more dynamic than the one in the box. I certainly could have been more extreme. Now that I've finished this model, I have a couple of other ideas of how I would pose a second, maybe a third model, and maybe I'll do that again. I don't know. But for now, I have one complete, not magnetized Aeldar Wraithlord, because for this model, I don't know that magnetizing is worth the effort. It certainly is doable, but it's finicky, and I don't know that you get the kind of value out of that kind of project that you would from other projects. So, you know, yes, you could swap out the missile launcher, or this, I guess, is a star cannon. You could swap it out for a shuriken cannon or something like that, but are you going to use this huge guy to take out a mob of orcs? No, this guy is slated for the enemy monsters, the baddies, the vehicles, maybe some enemy Terminators. If you're using this guy for a bunch of basic troopers, you're probably wasting those points on the battlefield, but what do I know? I don't actually play Warhammer 40k, so I may be completely wrong. The way my headcanon works, this guy is for monsters, vehicles, and other big baddies that need to go down in a hurry, so he's equipped in that way. The only thing I might have considered magnetizing is one of these weapons to swap it out for the kind of the last cannon, or the Eldari version of the last cannon. But I was just kind of looking at the number of attacks, because it has a ballistic skill of 4. So you've got a 50-50 shot of hitting your enemy. I don't know. I wanted something with more attacks, more wounds. I'm sacrificing some armor penetration for a better chance of actually putting wounds on my target. You know, your mileage may vary, but that's how I thought about it in my head. And anyway, the painting looks pretty good. You'll see here, it isn't necessarily always clear that some of these models are dry brushed, but if you look at it more closely, you can kind of see, oh yeah, it's dry brushed. Particularly in the legs, you see this piece that's kind of in shadow because of the dry brush and the way I applied it. There's not a lot of yellow paint there, and I think that communicates the shadow pretty well. For some of you, it might seem, oh man, it's just poorly painted, or it's incomplete paint application. Sure, fair, that's fine. For me, for my eye, it looks like shadow. I like the effect. You'll notice there's a couple other spots on the model where there's just not much white, and that's why the base coat is important, or the prime. I use black prime so that those parts that are missing some of that paint to represent shadow actually look like shadow. The highlights on the yellow are kind of hard to see. They're a little easier to see on some of these pieces, like these little weird flanges that the Aeldar models have. You can kind of see the yellow highlights a little bit cleaner. A couple of other spots you can kind of see it, but otherwise the two yellows kind of blended together, and that's fine. What is less kind of blendy, and I kind of like the way it looks, is the blue highlights. You'll notice very noticeably on the kind of the helmet piece, that weird oblong part right there, there is a considerable amount of kind of weird looking highlights. It looks weird, doesn't it? And the idea was on purpose, but the actual result was kind of accidental. I applied the highlights. I did with a dry brush. I went with kind of small circular motions, and it didn't go on kind of the way I anticipated, but the end result was kind of cool. it gives us the impression of round, and you know, that part of the model is round. You'll notice the pauldrons, you can kind of see it's more linear, the highlights on it, and that's also by design. And towards the bottom of that helmet, you can see where there's some spots of blue bisected by this kind of highlight. I did that on purpose. I wanted to kind of emphasize kind of yes, it's kind of cylindrical, but it's also long, and so that highlight goes down a little further than the rest of the highlights. I don't know if necessarily I would do it the same way again, but you know what? It's interesting. And you'll notice the edge highlighting of that same light blue on some of those other pieces. It's more notable on the darker parts of blue than it is in other parts, but I don't know. I'm happy with it. I think it looks pretty cool. Here's the sword. It's shiny and bright red, and I got that effect by adding a small coat, a thin coat of gloss varnish after my matte varnish on the overall model was done. You'll notice the same thing on this plasma weapon, although the places where it looks like there's kind of maybe not raw plasma, but like maybe a containment chamber, that's where kind of the emissive lights are, and so that's glossy as well. And of course there's kind of that Eldar gem there, and on the sword they're glossy, where all the other parts of the model are matte. Except for this is also matte, but the way I painted it, it kind of looks artificially shiny. Not sure how I feel about that effect. Well, I do. I like it. It wasn't intentional, but, you know, happy little accidents, man. I will take them all day. The thing I'm really unconvinced about are these flamethrowers. I don't know. I went with the usual meme where flamethrowers are for some reason always red or orange. I thought that would look cool, and it kind of doesn't, but I'll keep them to remind me that they're flamers on the wrist. And you can even see, this is the leg that I modded a little bit. You see how the leg normally has this little kind of ribbed thing that connects the two parts of the leg. It's behind the knee. I removed it entirely from this side, and you can tell because, again, my sculpting skills aren't very good, although this is a better result than I usually get. And it doesn't look too bad, but you'll notice that all that work bought me just a slight bend. Maybe in the future I should be more aggressive, or maybe just accept that this model isn't supposed to run very fast. It lumbers down the field, and that's just the nature of this model. Okay, some finishing touches that I want to talk about for this model that I think are pretty okay looking. Let's look at the base. Because when I modded this walker, he had to be standing on something. I mean, you know, it's the epic pose move. And so I had a few bits left over from some Imperial Knights. And so I put him on the base for my Dreadnought to be standing on something, and then just a little bit of extra flair aside from this kind of Eldar-y construct thing that looks like Wraithbone, so I painted it like bone, because Wraithbone is bone in my head. But just to kind of make it clear that it wasn't the Dreadnought that fell this night, although he might be able to do that, I made sure that, unlike the rest of the model, these parts, these armor panels from the Imperial Knights, these are older. These have been out in the field in water collecting a patina. So you'll see some patina, some of that really light blue patina that you would get from like bronze with copper pieces of it. There's a little bit more pronounced here, just to give it a sense that these pieces of armor have been on the battlefield longer than our buddy the Wraithlord has been. If this had been a model from almost any other army, the video would be over by now. But there's one more piece I want to share with you, and that's this weird-looking fella. I don't know if you guys have seen this. This is the old Eldar Dreadnought from 2nd edition. And he's weird-looking because he didn't survive the 20-plus years in storage as well as I had remembered or had thought. But I was able to cobble him together with some sticky putty because the head came off and one of the arms came off. I lost a piece back here that holds the weapons in place. I don't know where it is. But I have a bunch of these weapons pretty much fully painted. And this is kind of a heavy-duty metal model. you can kind of see the design inspiration. The big, weird, oblong head and the kind of really skinny legs. It's weird. As I was painting this model, I got so used to the look of it, I didn't remember how weird this one was. And I think it's probably missing these kind of like veins in the back too. I have no idea where those parts were. But I didn't do a great job painting this model originally. And I can fully acknowledge that. And I wonder if this was my attempt at repainting an old model at some point. I don't know. But it just, in my head, it was a lot cooler than it is in actuality. That's kind of a bummer. I was certainly capable of painting better because some of the other models that I have from this time period are better, but I'm not here to critique my ancient painting skills. I'm here to look at the models and kind of compare the two. And yeah, the new model, it's definitely a lot cooler looking than the old one. The old one it's goofy, man. It's goofy. It was imposing. It was cool for the time, but Games Workshop sculptors have just improved by leaps and bounds. I much rather have this guy than this guy. Although I'm keeping him around. Maybe I can salvage him somehow. The new model is a bit taller. Not by a ton, maybe 10, maybe 15% taller. It has, oddly enough, a better pose, or it's got more posability. You really couldn't do a ton with metal parts, at least not back then. Maybe people are much more comfortable filing and welding, I guess, or soldering pewter, but I never was, and I don't want to try that now. But it's wider, the arms are a little nicer. Overall, this is just a way better model, but man, nostalgia gets you right in the feels. Yay, old models. So hey, that's all I've got for this video. I hope you don't mind. I'm changing the format just a little bit. I'm making it less of a how-to and more about, I guess, really more about me and how I feel or how I react to the projects that I'm engaging in. I'm hoping that has more of a storytelling element and it's more entertaining, even if it's a little less informative. Because let's be honest, if you want to learn how to paint, you shouldn't be learning from me. You should be learning by all those people who are way better than me. But if you're curious to learn a little bit about how a relative noob paints these models quickly and relatively painlessly, give it a shot. You might learn something, and hopefully you'll hear an entertaining story that you can listen to while you're eating your cereal or your burritos or whatever it is. Thank you very much for watching. This has been your Average Bear Gaming. Have a wonderful afternoon. Be nice to yourselves. Ciao.